August 15th, 1940. RAF Tangmere, Sussex. The airfield trembled beneath the roar of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Hurricanes lifted off one after another, wheels folding beneath them as they climbed into the blinding sun. Below, the ground crews, oil-stained, sleepless, and deafened, shielded their eyes, watching their pilots vanish into the blue. Among them stood flight mechanic Fred Hill, a wiry man in his mid-30s with grease up to his elbows and a face lined by fatigue. He'd been on duty for 48 hours straight, patching holes, refueling aircraft, and replacing engines that barely cooled between sorties. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands and looked up just in time to see it happen. Another hurricane, its tail trailing smoke, dropping fast toward the field. "Bloody hell, not again!" someone shouted. The plane hit the runway hard, skidding, flames erupting from the fuselage. Ground crews sprinted forward, pulling the pilot from the cockpit seconds before the fuel tank exploded. The fireball lit the tarmac like sunrise. Hill turned away, jaw clenched. The same story every day. A few hits from a Bf-109's 20mm cannon, and the hurricane turned into a torch. Too many good men had died, not from their wounds, but from the inferno that followed. Later, in the hangar, the stench of burnt fuel lingered over the wreckage. Hill crouched beside the twisted remains of the tank, a thin aluminum shell, punctured in half a dozen places. The fuel had leaked instantly, catching fire on contact with the hot engine. His commanding officer, Squadron Leader Robert Balfour, approached. "We'll need a new fuselage," Balfour muttered grimly. "And another pilot." Hill didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the tank, on the shimmering residue of vaporized fuel. "It's not the bullets that kill them," he said finally. "It's what happens after." Balfour frowned. "You can't armor the whole plane, Fred. She wouldn't get off the ground." Hill shook his head. "Maybe not armor," he said quietly, "but something that stops the bleeding." That night, as the distant rumble of bombs echoed from London, Hill stayed behind in the workshop. He studied the wrecked tank by lamplight, sketching ideas on the back of a ration form. His mind drifted to a story he'd heard. American race cars using layers of rubberized fabric to stop leaks when tires burst. Rubber. It flexed. It expanded. What if it could seal? He reached into a supply crate and pulled out scraps of vulcanized rubber, left over from wheel repairs. He laid them over the tank holes and pressed them down with his thumb. The rubber stuck, even when he poured a bit of fuel over it. The next morning, he cut the sheets into layers. Rubber, canvas, more rubber, and glued them together. He pressed the composite against a damaged tank and waited. When he punctured it with a screwdriver, the material oozed shut, swelling against the leak. Hill grinned, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A simple, almost improvised idea that could mean the difference between life and death at 20,000 feet. He didn't know it yet. But that greasy patch of rubber would soon become one of the most important inventions of the war. The self-sealing fuel tank. The patch that wouldn't burn. August 18th, 1940. RAF Tangmere, Sussex. The hardest day. The morning began with sirens. Within minutes, the sky above the Sussex coast was filled with the throb of Merlin engines and the thunder of German bombs. Tangmere's hangars erupted in fire. Hurricanes scrambled under smoke and shrapnel. Flight mechanic Fred Hill threw himself flat as the blast from a Stuka's 250-kilogram bomb tore through the dispersal area. When the dust cleared, one of his fuel bowsers was a twisted wreck. He wiped soot from his face and ran toward the surviving Hurricanes, the ones still flyable. "Get them refueled! Move! Move!" shouted a sergeant. Hill sprinted to a plane riddled with holes, its starboard wing dripping aviation fuel. The pilot, bloodied and trembling, had just returned from intercepting a Heinkel He-111 formation. "She nearly went up," the man gasped. "Tracer rounds set the whole tank glowing red. Thought I was done for." Hill knelt by the leaking fuselage, fuel pooling beneath it. "Not if I can help it," he muttered. He ran to the maintenance truck, grabbing his crude experiment, a small square of rubberized fabric layered with vulcanized sheeting and treated adhesive. He slapped it over the puncture, pressing hard. The leak slowed, then stopped. A nearby mechanic laughed. "What's that supposed to be, Hill? A bandage for airplanes?" Hill didn't look up. "Call it what you like. If it keeps one bloke from burning, it's worth a try." 2 hours later, the Hurricanes were back in the air, diving headlong into another incoming raid. From the ground, the men watched black smoke bloom high above the channel. When the squadron returned, several aircraft were peppered with bullet holes. But one, Hurricane P-3120, landed with its starboard wing nearly shredded. The pilot climbed out, dazed but alive. "She took a cannon hit straight to the tank," he shouted to Hill. "Fuel everywhere, but no fire. Thought I'd had it, but she didn't blow." Hill sprinted to inspect it. There, amid scorched paint and mangled metal, the patch he'd applied earlier was blackened but intact. The rubber had swollen against the heat, sealing the rupture. The fuel hadn't ignited. The other ground crew gathered round, staring in disbelief. One finally said, "Bloody hell, Fred. You might have just saved his life." Hill shrugged, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. "Just trying to keep the planes flying." But word spread fast. Within days, officers from Hawker Aircraft Ltd. arrived to examine the modified tank. Hill explained how the rubber layers reacted to heat and pressure, forming a seal instead of a leak. He wasn't a scientist, but his demonstration, stabbing the patched section with a screwdriver and watching it seal over, left the engineers speechless. One of them, Chief Designer Sidney Cam, nodded slowly. "You're telling me this stuff can stop aviation fuel from igniting?" Hill grinned. "If it works on the ground, sir, it'll work up there." That week, Cam ordered the material tested at Brooklands. Using Hill's method, they lined the inside of the Hurricane's fuel tanks with alternating layers of rubber and treated fabric. When shot with incendiary rounds, the holes sealed almost instantly, fuel bubbling but not catching fire. The engineers called it a breakthrough. The pilots called it a miracle. By late August, the first Hurricanes equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks entered combat. On September 7th, the first night of the London Blitz, Squadron Leader Balfour's Hurricane was struck in a dogfight over the Thames estuary. His tank was hit, but instead of erupting, it hissed. Smoke, not flame. He limped back to base, landing safely. When he climbed out, he found Hill waiting at the dispersal bay. "Looks like your little trick worked," Balfour said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I owe you a pint." Hill smiled, exhausted. "Make it 2. That night, as bombers droned overhead and the city burned on the horizon, the Hurricanes of Fighter Command took off again. Fewer than before, but tougher than ever. The skies above Britain were still on fire. But for the men who flew her Hurricanes, the fear of burning alive was fading, thanks to one mechanic with dirty hands and a stubborn idea. September 15th, 1940, Battle of Britain Day, over London. The morning haze hung low over the Thames. From the ground, it looked like a watercolor sky, soft, serene. But at 20,000 feet, it was hell. Dozens of Hawker Hurricanes from No. 17 Squadron tore through the clouds, guns blazing. Below them, Messerschmitt Bf-109s twisted and dived, protecting the bombers lumbering toward London. Shells burst, tracers streaked, and the air itself seemed to burn. In one of those hurricanes flew squadron leader Robert Balfour, his jaw clenched, sweat beading under his oxygen mask. "Tally-ho!" he shouted into his radio, diving straight at a Heinkel He-111. His 8.303 Browning machine guns rattled, shells punching through the bomber's belly. Smoke poured from its starboard engine. Then, the warning he dreaded. A flash, a jolt. The smell of fuel. Balfour's control stick went stiff. The instrument panel cracked. An enemy shell had torn straight through his right wing. He braced himself, waiting for the fire, the heat that always came next. But it didn't come. The smell of fuel lingered, but the flames never caught. He looked over his shoulder and saw only a thin trail of vapor, not the roaring inferno he'd seen claim so many friends. "Still flying," he muttered. "Still bloody flying." He brought the Hurricane around for another pass, heart hammering. Behind him, 2 Messerschmitts latched onto his tail. Bullets ripped across his fuselage. Sparks flew, but his plane refused to burn. He yanked the stick, dove into cloud cover, and shook them off. Down below, on the ground at RAF Tangmere, Fred Hill was elbow-deep in engine oil when the air raid siren started. The sky filled with contrails and echoing thunder. Through binoculars, he caught glimpses of the battle. Flashes of silver and flame above the distant smoke columns rising from London. He'd lost count of how many Hurricanes he'd patched, rebuilt, or buried. But every time one came back riddled with holes and not on fire, he felt a quiet surge of pride. Hours later, the battle ended. The surviving Hurricanes limped home one by one, their paint scorched, wings torn. But most of them alive. When Balfour's aircraft landed, ground crews rushed to meet it. The right wing was shredded, the tank pierced clean through, but unburned. Inside, the self-sealing liner had bubbled shut, hard as leather. Hill ran a hand along the blackened edge, the smell of charred rubber still strong. He looked up at Balfour, who was climbing down from the cockpit, grinning through exhaustion. "Well?" Hill asked. "She took a hit from a 20mm at point blank," Balfour said. "Didn't catch, not even a spark." He clapped Hill on the shoulder. "Fred, you've saved more pilots than the RAF could ever count." That evening, as the sun set behind smoke-streaked skies, the base loudspeakers crackled with the day's totals. The Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft, the RAF fewer than half that. In the mess hall, pilots raised their mugs not to strategy or command, but to the engineers who kept their machines alive. Fred Hill sat quietly at the edge of the room, listening as laughter filled the air for the first time in weeks. He didn't speak, but he couldn't stop the faint smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. The next day, orders came down from the Air Ministry. All Hurricanes and Spitfires were to be equipped with the new self-sealing fuel tanks, effective immediately. At factories in Kingston, Brooklands, and Langley, assembly lines roared back to life. Sheets of Hill's composite rubber fabric were rolled, cut, and pressed into every fighter wing the RAF could produce. Pilots would later joke that their aircraft had Fred Hill's fingerprints in every seam. By the time the Battle of Britain reached its climax, those fingerprints were everywhere, unseen, unsung, but vital. The Luftwaffe had failed to burn Britain out of the war. And every hurricane that limped home in smoke and sparks instead of fire carried a trace of one mechanic's stubborn refusal to accept that good enough was ever enough. From his small corner of Tangmere's hangar, Fred Hill had unknowingly changed the course of the air war, not with a weapon, but with an idea. A patch that wouldn't burn, a miracle made of rubber and grit. The Mechanics' War. October 1940. RAF Tangmere, Sussex. The nights were longer now, the skies colder. The Blitz was in full fury. From Tangmere's battered airfield, the glow of London's fires painted the horizon red. Bombers droned overhead like a heartbeat in the clouds. Inside the hangar, the hurricane lamps flickered. Fred Hill worked by their light, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands raw and black with soot. Around him lay the wrecks of war, twisted panels, scorched engines, and here and there, the jagged remnants of bullet-riddled fuel tanks. But lately, there was something different about those tanks. They no longer reeked of charred metal and burnt flesh. They bore scars, but they were intact. They had done their job. "Fred," called a young corporal, ducking under the wing of a half-repaired Hurricane. "They've radioed from Group Command. One of ours crash-landed outside Maidstone. Pilot's alive. Tank didn't go up." Hill didn't look up. He just kept working, tightening the bolts on a newly sealed assembly. "Good," he muttered. "Means the rubber's doing what it's meant to." The corporal hesitated, then added, "He said to tell you personally, thanks for saving his hide." Hill stopped. The words hung in the air, quiet and awkward. He nodded once, then turned back to his work, his jaw tight. Tell him to bring the plane back in one piece next time. That same week, at Hawker Aircraft in Kingston, Chief Designer Sidney Cam stood before a group of Air Ministry officials and engineers. On the table before him lay a cross-section of Hill's innovation. Layered rubber and treated fabric, dark and unassuming, yet miraculous in its effect. Cam tapped the material with a pencil. "This," he said, "is what's keeping our boys in the sky." One official frowned. "You're telling us a patchwork of rubber and glue is saving the Royal Air Force?" Cam met his gaze coolly. "Yes, because one mechanic at Tangmere refused to accept that our fighters should go up in flames like tinder. You do well to remember his name." By winter, Fred Hill's self-sealing system had become standard on every frontline fighter. Hurricanes, Spitfires, even the new Typhoons under development. Factories worked around the clock, and every sheet of rubber produced in Britain seemed to vanish into aircraft wings and fuselages. The results were undeniable. RAF survival rates in fire-related crashes dropped by more than half. Pilots who once dreaded fuel hits now returned with nothing worse than smoke and a shaky landing. In his spare hours, few though they were, Hill read letters sent to the station. Some came from pilots he'd never met. "You don't know me, but I owe you my life. Your tanks don't burn, and because of that, neither do we." He kept the letters in a tobacco tin in his locker, alongside a small wrench engraved with the words Tangmere 40, November 1940. The Battle of Britain was effectively over. The Luftwaffe had failed. London still smoldered, but the RAF stood unbroken. That night, as the all-clear sirens echoed across the base, Hill stepped outside the hangar for the first time in hours. The wind smelled of rain and cordite. Overhead, searchlights still cut lazy arcs through the clouds. From the dispersal huts, laughter drifted, the laughter of men who had survived another day. Hill took a deep breath, looking at the row of Hurricanes waiting for dawn. Their patched wings gleamed under the pale moonlight, scars of steel and rubber, quiet proof of endurance. He smiled faintly and muttered, "That'll do." The mechanic stubbed out his cigarette, turned off the lamps, and walked back into the dark. He would never win medals or headlines. Most of Britain would never know his name. But in every dogfight above the Channel, every smoke-streaked landing on England's green fields, Fred Hill's idea was there, unseen, unheralded, but indispensable. And for the young men who flew those hurricanes through fire and fury, that idea was worth more than armor, more than speed, more than glory. It was survival. A quiet triumph born not in an office or a factory, but in a mechanic's hands, beneath the roar of engines and the falling of bombs.